Zap is a staple card in Clash Royale. It's a necessary force to keep low HP and charging cards in check. Today, it is simply one of many small spells to pick from, but back in the day, this tiny blue bottle used to rule Clash Royale, being the sole 2-elixir spell and at one point used in nearly 100% of meta decks. I'm not exaggerating when I say this was one of the most influential cards in Clash Royale history. Decks were created specifically around trying to beat it, and in the last 8 years, it's only ever received nerfs, and it's still one of the most used spells in the game today. Despite not receiving many direct changes, Supercell has added and done many things to influence the position of this card, leading to many rises and falls. So let's talk about why this card was so influential, why it took so long to get properly nerfed, and look at how it's doing today. Zap is an OG 42 card, meaning it's been in the game since the first day of beta, and at first glance, it appears quite similar to how it is today, but there are some key differences. This was a common spell, meaning unlike the rare and epic spells, it lacked any sort of special ability. This and arrows were the only common spells, but each had their own advantages. Arrows cost 1 more elixir to play and had to travel through the air to reach its target, unlike Zap, which was instant. So if you had a Hog Rider and your opponent defended it with Skeleton Army, Zap would not only save you elixir, but take them out much quicker, minimizing the damage dealt to your Hog. Mind you, that arrows were much slower back then, so it definitely wasn't something to be overlooked. However, on the plus side, it had a much bigger radius and dealt more damage. The only major interaction difference between Zap and arrows was that arrows could take out minions. Zap dealt the exact damage of the hit points of a goblin, so anything with equal or less health could be dealt with by a Zap. It was super effective against goblin barrels and skeleton armies, and plenty of other cards had the goblin or skeleton troops in it. And if your opponent used offensive minions, you could take them out with Zap and the assistance of the tower. It could also be combined with the fireball to finish off troops that fireball couldn't quite take care of on its own. This included several 5 elixir troops. It was a -1 elixir trade since Fireball was 4 elixir, but since spells did 50% of their damage to crown towers, it was still good value if you could get those in. Outside of these niche situations though, Zap actually wasn't that useful. Depending on what your opponent played, it could be absolutely useless. However, for 2 elixir, you can't expect much. It was the cheapest spell, but it clearly wasn't enough to garner players' interests, as looking at the January 2016 top ladder use rates, Zap was one of only 5 cards to see absolutely no play. This is especially insane when you consider how few options there were for spells back then. While Zap was at the bottom, arrows were at the very top, being the most used card in top ladder in nearly 3/4 of decks. Minions were a lot more influential than any skeleton or goblin card, so having a spell to counter them was much better. Arrows were more versatile, being able to take out anything a Zap could. Sure, skeleton and goblin troops appeared in a lot of cards, but you didn't always need to Zap 1 to 2 elixir cards like spear goblins or skeletons. The only time Zap ever shined was against goblin barrel and skeleton army, but arrows could take them out for a positive elixir trade just fine, and both of those cards combined had less usage than the minion horde anyway. So about a month after launch, Zap would receive a buff. On February 9th, 2016, Zap's damage was increased by 6%. This was a very pointless buff. It did not change any interactions, and the damage difference was so little that there really wouldn't be a situation where this Zap would have done better than the old Zap. But hey, a buff is a buff. It could only help. And this buff drew some interest as some top players were starting to include it after this, but it was still by far the least used damage dealing spell in the game. Balancing the Zap and arrows was going to be tricky just because there wasn't really much the balancing team could do besides tweaking their damage. Fun fact, in the game's alpha days, Zap actually dealt a lot more damage, so much that it could fully take out minions. But obviously if it was able to maintain this interaction in beta, there really wouldn't have been a need for arrows, which helps prove this fact. However, they definitely had plans because this was just the first of 3 balance changes the card would receive this month. Only 10 days after this damage buff, Zap would appear in the balance changes yet again, but this time receiving a nerf. The damage it dealt to crown towers was being lowered by 20%, from 50% of its total damage to 40%. Even though Zap had been performing poorly, just about every other spell in the game was doing great. A popular strategy was cycling spells as a primary source of tower damage, so to fix this, a standardization change was applied to all damage-dealing spells. It wasn't a deserved nerf for Zap, it just got caught in the crossfire. But Supercell wasn't gonna let it rot, because in another 10 days, Zap would appear in the balance changes yet again. And this would undoubtedly be one of the biggest buffs a card has ever received in Clash Royale history. And funny enough, it wasn't even a straight buff, it was technically a rework. Its 6% damage increase from a few weeks prior was reverted, but in return it would receive a brand new ability, which would be a stun or freeze effect that lasted for a full second. It functioned the same as the Freeze's freezing ability, just lasting shorter. This idea actually came from a Reddit post, and Supercell just liked the idea, so they implemented it. Interestingly enough, the community was kind of split on this, some believing this would make little difference. It was a bit weird to give an ability like this to a common card, but it was clear that without something big like this, finding a balance between this and Arrows was going to be tricky. It was kind of unfair though, because Arrows received no special ability and wouldn't until years later. Zap just needed it more right now, so it got it, and this stun would have a drastic impact on Clash Royale forever. Now it had a second, completely unique function different from what it could already do. Not only did Zap freeze troops, but also caused them to retarget onto the closest enemy. For example, if the opponent's Expo or Mortar locked onto your tower, you could place something down and then zap the building to retarget it. Zap would also reset the charge of any charging troop like Prince in the brand new Dark Prince, and it was especially useful in supporting any troop in a multitude of circumstances to allow them to get an extra hit on something. This card was finally useful against more than 2 cards, and the ability fit it naturally. In the leading weeks of this buff, Zap's rates would slowly increase, rising to about 16% usage in top ladder by the end of the month, which was about average for the time. Arrows were still by far the most used spell in the game. But wait, shouldn't the usage have been higher? I did say this was one of the biggest buffs in Clash Royale history. Well, although Zap was certainly far better now, the same update that buffed Zap also introduced another environmental factor which only created more demands for Arrows. This was all thanks to a new card, the Princess, a troop that died to Arrows, but not Zap. This card was extremely popular, and considering the consistently popular minion horde on top of that, carrying Arrows in your deck was still practically a must. And there wasn't a reason to carry both Zap and Arrows in the same deck. However, over the next few weeks, Zap's usage would continue to climb. By mid to late May, it was in over half of the top ladder decks, which meant it finally surpassed Arrow's use rate. It was commonly used in Hog Rider decks because it could help Hogs get one extra hit almost every time regardless of the situation. Royal Giant users were also finding success with it to redirect Inferno Towers off of it into cheap swarms. I could be here all day listing situations that was useful. It's hard to find one where it isn't. By this point, every archetype was including it. By this point, it was easily considered to be one of the best, not just spells, but cards in the game. Players were finally realizing its potential. If all that wasn't enough though, Supercell also added a new card in May 2016 called Sparky, who had to charge up her attack for 5 seconds, but when zapped or frozen, its attack completely reset. This gave Zap another leg up against all the other damage dealing spells. Now, Sparky wasn't too viable right now, so it didn't matter too much, but it just goes to show how much love Supercell was showing this card, and of course it will matter later when Sparky is competitively viable. That wasn't the only major thing that helped Zap this month though. The freeze spell was nerfed, making Hog freeze decks less popular. Since Zap and Freeze had similar functions in Hog decks, it helped to solidify Zap's place in that archetype since, by comparison, it became a much better option. Every week now, Zap was pushing a new all-time high. By late June, it was the second most used card in Clash Royale, appearing in almost every top deck. Which is why it would be very surprising that in July, Zap would receive a buff. It was more of a consistency game rule change, not an actual balance change, but it heavily favored Zap. I find it funny that they nerfed Zap for consistency when it was bad, but now they were buffing it for consistency when it's OP. These changes just came at terrible times. Fun fact, this is the last buff the card's ever received. It's all nerfs from here. So what was this change? Well, Zap would now perform better against 2 other cards. The first was Elixir Collector. Zap would now halt Elixir production when used on a pump. It's strange that this isn't how it worked in the first place. Using Zap against Elixir Collector was practically pointless before and after this change. As I said, this was mostly for consistency, but the new interaction that would make a huge difference is Zap now completely resetting the Inferno Tower. Zap reset a Prince charge and a Sparky charge, so why shouldn't it reset an Inferno Tower charge? Unlike the Elixir Collector, this interaction made a huge difference. It was a massive indirect nerf to Inferno Tower, and this change prompted anybody playing a heavy tank to pair it with Zap in case they already weren't. Following this change, Zap was not just overpowered, but one of the most influential, powerful cards in Clash Royale history. It seemed silly for Supercell to not have given it at least a small nerf to compensate for these favorable interaction changes. Even without a buff, I think a nerf would have been justified, but when players don't complain, Supercell is less likely to take action. Zap was not only very cheap, but also a spell. Both factors that typically allow a card to fly under the radar even if it's too strong due to it not feeling disruptive. Zap was just a light spell that was in and out in a second, barely seen. If you lost to Zap, you'd probably notice the win condition it was supporting and get upset at that instead. As I said, Royal Giant paired very well with Zap, but despite Zap having a way higher use rate than Royal Giant, people wanted Royal Giant nerfed into oblivion. Even though a nerf to Zap would have inevitably led to it supporting Royal Giant less, thus making that card worse indirectly. Now, there was another important thing that came in this update that was likely Supercell's attempt to put Zap's reign to rest. After 7 months, Supercell would finally add another 2-elixir spell to provide some true competition to the Zap. Not just a 2-elixir spell, but the first legendary spell ever added, known as none other than the Log. With another 2-elixir spell in the mix, things were going to get interesting. Log had a few key advantages over Zap, the main one being that it dealt more damage. This meant it could take out princesses and ice spirits, things Zap couldn't deal with on its own, in addition to what troops Zap could take out already. It also knocked troops back as its ability, temporarily preventing them from attacking. Knocking stuff back had some unique advantages over stunning, but this was clearly not enough to dethrone Zap, as a few days after the introduction, Zap was still used in nearly 80% of decks while Log was not used in a single one. Very reminiscent of the position Zap and Arrows were in during beta. Despite Log's advantages, it had way too many disadvantages for anybody to take it seriously. Besides dealing with princesses, there was basically no situation where you would want to have a Log instead of a Zap. Zap was instantaneous, whereas Log slowly rolled. Zap could target air units, and the stun affected every card in the game, unlike Log, whose knockback effect didn't work on buildings or heavy cards. Somehow, even when used in nearly 80% of decks, Zap's rates were only going up. Zap wasn't just a solid tool anymore, it was necessary to play or build around in order to succeed in the competitive scene. 6 weeks after those balance changes went live, Zap had reached its all-time peak. The highest of highs, higher than any card has ever reached in any game mode at any point. 98% usage. Now, higher usage rates were easier to achieve back then since there were only about half the cards that there are today, but that's still an extremely impressive feat. I don't think another card has ever even made it to 90. The second most used card was Poison at 81% usage, which is also extremely high. I'm not even really bothering to show specific decks with Zap because it's literally just every top deck around this time. The Zap meta decks were just the general meta decks. Archetype did not matter whatsoever. Most decks in Clash Royale history up to this point had at least one big and one small spell, and this era of the game had some of the worst spell diversity than at any point in history. Zap and Poison were the go-to choices. The slowness of Poison combined with the stun of the Zap made it so hard for enemy troops to do anything. Now, it does not matter how undisruptive a card is, how unnoticeable it may be, or how much competition it lacks. 98% usage is unacceptably high and just proves Supercell had let this card be too strong for too long. At this point, there weren't even 8 cards in a deck. You start with a Zap and go from there. It took a while, but in August 2016, Supercell finally took action. The Zap would receive a nerf, and it was a major one. The stun duration would go from a full second down to half a second. The same set of balance changes would also give some hefty buffs to the Log, hoping to make it a more attractive option. However, these balance changes made little difference. Zap's usage fell a lot, but it was still the second most used cards in the game, and Log was still not making a splash. Supercell would go on to give the Log an incredible amount of buffs. 3 months in a row, they buffed the Log 3 times. 6 individual stat buffs, plus giving it the ability to knock back any ground troop. This helped it to give it the versatility of the Zap stun ability. Supercell was determined to knock Zap from its throne without nerfing it directly. For months it continued to be the most popular spell, remaining in about 2/3 of top decks. But after the 3rd set of Log buffs in October 2016, Zap was finally knocked from its throne. Decks were now getting along just fine with having a Log and an Ice Spirit. Ice Spirit jumped on troops and froze them for longer than a Zap stunned for half the cost. Although it certainly had its disadvantages, this plus the Log was a good enough substitute for Zap in some decks. Don't get me wrong though, Zap was nowhere near being a bad card. Quite the opposite. It was still the second most used spell in the game, it's just the first time in months it wasn't number 1. Both Zap and Log were viable cards now, and would surge and fall in usage depending on what the environment was. Although Log was gonna remain at the top for a while, Zap's usage started to trickle back up. By November, they were the second and third most used cards in top ladder. They were both such good spells that they weren't really competing with each other so much anymore. A lot of players were opting to use them together. They both had very unique abilities and served different enough functions that making room for both of them was worth it. This period was brief though. In December 2016, Zap had taken back its throne, being the most used card, appearing in 83% of top ladder decks. There were many environmental factors that led to this. One of these was due to the Mega Minion. Mega Minion was a very prevalent card, and although Zap could not even get close to taking it out, it would help prevent all damage when a lone Mega Minion at full health was approaching the tower. It prevented two devastating swings that the log was helpless against. Elite Barbarians were also quite popular at this time, and when supporting them on offense, you needed to be quick because they were quick. A log would not help them fast enough against cheap swarms. Zap's instant deploy was way more helpful. The Ice Golem was also in the mix, and Zap was a great synergizer to this mini tank because the Ice Golem's Frost Nova with the assistance of Zap could take out minions, which of course the log couldn't do since it didn't affect air units. So with Zap back to being the second most used card in the game and being used twice as much as the log, Supercell took drastic action. In January 2017, Zap's damage was decreased by 6%, which doesn't sound too bad until you realize this caused a major interaction change. Now Zap would not be able to take out goblins at an equal level. This seemed devastating as it felt like that was important for keeping goblins in check. But on top of that, a new card, the Goblin Gang, would be released only 1 month later, which also had the Goblin Troop in it. Zap not being able to fully take out any of that was a huge blow, and some players believed the card would be dead after this. Supercell simply claims that Zap had been overused for too long, and they also wanted to make arrows more useful since the power of Zap and Log combined was making them irrelevant. The players did have a point about the Goblin interaction though. Zap was the primary way of dealing with them, so this change instantly made Goblin Barrel a more effective win condition and Goblins a much safer defense. Given the low use rates though, Supercell did not give them a preemptive nerf, and that seemed like the smart move because Goblins, Goblin Barrel, and Arrows had healthy rises following this change. Zap was still the second most used card in the game, just behind the log. Following the release of the Goblin Gang though, it fell further. Over the coming months, you started to see the rise of a new deck type called Logbait, which typically consisted of the Goblin Gang, Goblin Barrel, and Princess. Logbait would remain popular through 2017, so you'd naturally think demand for Zap would fall pretty low since it can't deal with any of those cards as well as the log. But the most popular variant of this new Logbait archetype included Inferno Tower, which Zap had the upper hand against, so there was still demand. Zap's stun still had a lot of utility, which helped it to remain relevant even in a goblin-heavy meta, but it was no longer the dominant spell. For the next few months, it would remain in around 30 to 40% of top decks, which was still way above average. But without its ability to kill goblins, Logbait was able to flourish, which kept the demand for log even higher. Most decks used one or the other, but some continued to use both, the most notable being Giant Triple Spell. The addition of Night Witch also helped Zap a bit, since it summoned a new Bat Troop which had the same health as a skeleton, but was an air unit, meaning log was pointless against it. Zap certainly wasn't the best answer to Night Witch, but if you needed to clean up a clump of bats, it was certainly going to help a lot more than a piece of wood. The Bat Troop would get its own separate card later in the year, and after a hefty buff in August 2017, it was everywhere. Bats were a great addition to help the balance of spells. It was 2 elixir, so arrows were a negative elixir trait against them, and it was something log couldn't take out that Zap could. Because of their prominence in top ladder in August 2017, Zap was back up to not just being the #1 spell, but #1 card in the game. The Inferno Dragon was also really starting to rise during this period, which no spell could completely get rid of besides Rocket, so you need troops to deal with it, and Zap was a very good assistant in that process. Zap and Log would continue to be at each other's throats for that #1 spot though. Spells are very reactive to the meta, which is why the rates fluctuate more than most cards. Regardless, it didn't really matter, because even when one of the 2 spells was heavily used over the other, the lesser used one was still one of the most used cards in the game. In part thanks to Zap's and Log's prominent usage, in December 2017, all damage-dealing spells would receive a Crown Tower damage reduction. Spells would now only deal 35% of their total damage to Crown Towers rather than 40%. This standardization was mostly thanks to bigger spells like Rocket and Fireball, but it couldn't hurt to nerf these smaller spells too, considering how overused they were, and they wanted to be consistent. Zap didn't need to be able to whittle down Crown Towers so quickly, but since it dealt the least damage of any damage-dealing spell, it made virtually no difference anyway. In the same set of balance changes, a lot of Logbait cards were nerfed, diminishing Log's necessity, causing Zap's usage to skyrocket again to be in about 2/3 of top ladder decks, 30% more than the second most used card, and it only kept going up from here. The log's only real advantage was the cards it took out that the Zap couldn't, and with those cards being way less prominent going into 2018, Zap was able to maintain its #1 spot for most of the year. The real big issue here was that there weren't many cards that filled the role Zap Log and Arrows did. So rather than playing whack-a-mole with small spells until they're all dead, the devs decided to increase the competition by adding more small spells. In March 2018, the Barbarian Barrel was added as a 3-elixir ground-only spell similar to Log. It was very different from the Zap Spell and overall not a very good card at launch, so it didn't cause a dent in the Zap's usage initially. In fact, only a couple months later, Zap hit a peak of 75% usage in Top Ladder. Only a few months after that, though, would Supercell add yet another small spell. This would be the Giant Snowball, a 2-elixir spell that dealt less damage than a Zap, just barely enough to take out Spear Goblins. It had a bigger radius though, and dealt knockback and slowness upon collision, having the ability to hit air but also knock things back. It didn't knock back anything the Log could though, nor reset Inferno Towers or Sparkies. But like the Barbarian Barrel, it was pretty weak on launch, so it didn't cast a shadow in the Zap spotlight whatsoever. But Supercell did heavily buff these cards throughout the year. Barbarian Barrel's cost was eventually lowered to 2 elixir and even able to take out archers at one point. It couldn't attack air, but it could distract air and Inferno cards or just summon a Barbarian that would be great on defense. Giant Snowball's damage was increased to match Zap's, and several cards including Inferno Dragon and Balloon lost their knockback immunity, which made Snowball way more effective against them. At first, these cards were no threat to Zap, but they started getting some serious advantages that made some players ditch the blue bottle. By the end of the year, Zap was still one of the most used cards in the game, but it had fallen a lot from its peak. The Giant Snowball damage buff didn't seem like it was going to do much since there was no major interaction differences, but in the first few months of 2019, it started radically rising in popularity, but that was more likely due to the new Ram Rider. Barbarrel and Snowball had taken over as the dominant small spells, so you saw another massive dip in Zap usage. I must reiterate though, all 4 2-elixir spells here still had above average rates. None of them were considered unviable. It was very common to see players using multiple small spells in one deck during this time, which suggests it wasn't just a competition issue when it came to Zap's generally high usage. Once the Barbarian Barrel was nerfed in August 2019, the Snowball, Zap, and Log were all fighting for that #1 spot. Their usage rates were really close, and it seems like this was Supercell's goal, as Seth, the community manager, said that ideally all 4 2-elixir spells would each have a 25% use rate. But with Snowball a bit ahead and Barbarian Barrel a bit behind, they would each get a small adjustment in October and November 2019. Arrows would also finally get a rework in November as well, bringing them back into the meta, and these would be the last changes any small spell would get for a long time. 2019 was just Supercell trying to find that perfect balance. By the end of the year, it still wasn't perfect, but it was the best it's been yet. 2020 started off good for Zap. The recently buffed wall breakers helped Minor Cycle with bats to thrive, and anytime bats were in the meta, the demands for Zap rose. But that archetype kept periodically getting nerfed throughout the year, causing Zap's rates to trickle down. It also got another Crown Tower reduction nerf in August 2020, but again it was a general change made to all spells and made virtually no difference. Although Zap never lost its place, Barbarian Barrel and Log were emerging as the superior small spells, boxing it out a bit. It also got a bit worse following the Electro Spirit release in October 2020. For half the cost, Electro Spirit could reset troops and take out skeletons just like Zap, deal more damage to towers for better chip, as well as serve as a distraction. The chain stun it had made it efficient at hitting multiple troops, which made it more efficient at countering something like bats than Ice Spirit would. Even though it clearly wasn't a direct replacement for Zap, it could do some of the things Zap could do better, which made having a Zap less necessary. The new Electro Giant also decreased the need for Zap. If you were using Electro Giant, you didn't need Zap to protect your tank against an Inferno or any small swarms. Its Force Field would take care of all of that. And if all that wasn't bad enough, Sparky would receive a major nerf in November 2020. Sparky had sort of cultivated a meta which made it very necessary to have some sort of stun card in your deck, but this nerf changed that. But even before the nerf, Zap wasn't even needed if you needed a stun card. In early 2016, Zap and Freeze were the only cards with a reset ability. But over the years, they had added so many cards with that ability that if you really needed a stun, you could work in one of the stun troops and use a Log for your direct damage spell. The environment was overall shifting to disfavor Zap, which was clearly shown by its drop in usage. Things didn't change much in 2021. I'm not going to bother covering much because there weren't really any major developments. It was maintaining around 20% usage in Grand Challenges for most of the year, but dipped again by the end. Log was just becoming better suited for the changing environment, so more players were ditching Zap for it. Around the start of 2022, Royal Hogs were popular with the Archer Queen, and you don't really need to worry about Inferno cards with a Swarm win condition. Skeleton King Swarm decks were popular as well, and of course when the meta is filled with ground low HP units, Log is going to have the advantage because it deals more damage, and like with Royal Hogs, having a stun isn't necessary. And things would get even worse in the latter half of 2022. From June to August, Electro Giant was very popular, and with him everywhere, a Zap was practically useless. October 2022 is when we'd start to see the bigger, more permanent developments. Firstly, the Goblins and Goblin Gang each received one additional unit. They had both been pretty irrelevant for a while up to this point, but these buffs brought them back in a big way. With Goblins being so prevalent again, most players had no choice but to adapt. The Phoenix was also added in October 2022. Now initially this didn't favor any small spell, but only a few weeks after release, the Phoenix Egg's HP was decreased, allowing Log and Barbarian Barrel, but not Zap, to completely take it out. Despite being nerfed, Phoenix was going to be very prevalent in the Clash Royale meta for many months to come, so having Log or Barbarian Barrel to deal with the Egg was going to be very handy. And finally, perhaps the biggest development that caused Zap to suffer this year, in December, the Rage spell would receive a rework. This rework would change it to be a direct damage spell rather than solely act as support. Now it dealt the exact damage as a Zap, had a slightly larger radius, but gave off a rage effect instead of a stun while costing the same. This made it a significantly better choice than Zap in some situations. The only thing I think even remotely helped Zap in 2022 was the addition of the Mighty Miner, since it had a charge attack that could be reset, but it didn't give Zap an advantage over Log because Log could also reset its attack. 2022 was perhaps the worst year for Zap yet, but of course it still wasn't completely gone. I don't think 2022 was the worst year for Zap ever though, because 2023 would be the year where Zap would hit its lowest low since 2016. So what led to that? In the first few months of the year, you just saw a lot of loggable and arrowable cards receiving buffs, which made higher damage dealing small spells more desirable. One of these included the Firecracker getting an evolution. Evolved Firecracker was meta-defining, which made arrows more of a necessity. Even though arrows could not take out an evolved Firecracker, you had to play the regular Firecracker twice to get to it, so arrows could at least help with that. Arrows and Log were easily the best small spells, and they became so overused that players actually began calling for buffs to the Zap Spell, which was a bit odd to me because despite it being one of the least used small spells, it was a key player in some prominent decks maintaining respectable usage. It may not have had the ideal usage for a small spell, but buffing it to compete with Log and arrows I think would have required way too big of a buff to lead to an overall healthy metagame. It definitely wasn't on a good path though. So many troops with just a little more HP than Zap dealt were flooding the meta. If you needed solid direct damage for a low cost, there were better options. If you needed a stun card, there were better options. I think the appropriate way to go would have been to nerf Log or arrows, followed by a nerf to any cards that exceptionally thrived due to the lack of their presence. But many players are opposed to nerfs to small spells, especially the Log. Zap would continue to hover around 8 to 12% usage for the next few months. Something needed to happen to balance this out. Whether it was indirect or direct buffs or nerfs or new cards that Zap countered better than the other spells, it needed help. In March 2024, Supercell would finally help the Zap spell for the first time in nearly 8 years. It wouldn't be a buff, but rather an evolution, and it was actually the first spell in Clash Royale to get one. The evolved Zap would come in 3 waves, sort of like arrows, and with each wave the radius would get half a tile bigger. All 3 waves would each deal the same damage as a regular Zap and stun for half a second, so it was essentially 3 for the price of 1. The 3 waves combined dealt less damage than a Fireball, but could still take out a lot of what Fireball could deal with. Because it came in waves, it could even deal with guards, which even arrows couldn't do anymore. And just to prevent charging cards from being able to charge for a longer period of time. It was so much value. Combine that with being the only spell to have an evolution, and Zap was back on top, peaking to being in about half of Grand Challenge decks. Evolved Zap put all the other spells back in their place. It was going to have a major advantage over other small spells until they got evolutions, but that wouldn't happen for a long time. With Evolved Zap being so overused, Supercell decided to tone it down in the May balance changes. Its second and third waves damage would be decreased by 50%, which wasn't even enough to kill Spear Goblins. Well, technically it was closer to a 51% reduction, but the patch notes say 50. The total damage is still effectively the same as 2 Zaps though, so for simplicity reasons, I'll say it's half. With this major total damage reduction, Evolved Zap could no longer take out the fireballers. It was still useful in taking out things normal Zap couldn't, like archers, firecrackers, and bombers, all of which had an evolution, as well as loggables like Princess and Dark Goblin. And remember, even though you were only getting double the damage now, you were still getting triple the stun. This area of denial went a long way. The card was still doing just fine after the nerf, appearing in around 20% of Grand Challenge decks, but Log and Arrows once again overtook it in terms of popularity. But it did have one more upsurge in June with the rise of the new Goblin Curse spell. Goblin Curse was yet another 2-elixir spell that was actually more popular than Zap, but instead of boxing it out, it actually synergized quite well with it because the curse didn't do a lot of damage, but anything that died to it was turned into a goblin, so the Zap could make up for that weakness, helping to quickly turn swarms into hordes of goblins. However, once Goblin Curse was inevitably nerfed, it settled back down to where it was before the curse was added. And that pretty much brings us to today. Zap has always been a necessary check in Clash Royale. This card may not rule the game like it used to, but it certainly holds an important place in the game even today. As of September 2024, it is the most used evolution, so it clearly doesn't need any more help. If Supercell treats this like they have with small spells in the past, they'll probably keep Evolved Zap in that number 1 position. It'll be interesting to see if it falls off again once other small spells get evolutions. If you're a relatively new player, you probably see Zap as nothing but a generic, boring spell. But if you're an older player like me, you know how impactful this card was throughout the game's first few years, and that's why I wanted to make this video. Zap is such a prominent card in this game's history, and it's nice to reminisce about the times where the whole game circulated around it. This next thing I know I've said in both videos I made covering the other small spells, but I think the log needs a nerf. The fact it's still one of the most used spells in the game despite Zap having an evolution is insane to me. I think toning it down a bit will make room for the other small spells, including non-evolved Zap, to thrive. Evolution Zap is a little overused, but I don't think the solution to that is nerfing it. It's increasing the competition. And I'm curious to see what creative things Supercell comes up with for the other spells. But let me know how you think the spell situation should be handled and which card's history you want to see next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.